So my talk is, I'm not really going to talk so much about my life, because where to begin? But the title of my talk is Learning How to Think. And perhaps you saw that and thought, well, that's, I kind of know how to think. I'm doing it right now. But I think that the way we think can be improved. And I'm saying that because this is something that happened to me. And I guarantee you, it literally changed my life. So I'm hoping I can share a few things that hopefully you'll find something that you can pick from. I'm going to start with a story about when I got to high school. I came to high school in Uganda from a very, very different sort of curriculum. In my primary school, we just had this way of learning that was different. We didn't have exams, for instance. So our reports at the end of the term would read things like, Nancy is a sensitive child who enjoys literature and music, And there were no tests and there were no exams, and it was fun. It was fun to learn. So I got to high school and everything was different. High school in Uganda, in boarding school. And I remember going into this classroom, I think it was an agriculture lesson, and the teacher's name was Mr. Opio. That I will not forget. And so as he starts the agriculture lesson, I decide to ask a question. So I raise my hand, and everybody is looking at me like, who raises their hand in class? Yeah. And then Mr. Opio says yes. And I'm like, I just want to know, why is it important that we study agriculture? So everyone laughs, and I'm wondering why are they laughing. And then this teacher looks at me and says something like, "Wana we know lugezigezi," and essentially crushed my dream of getting an answer. And it seemed like a small moment, but when I look back, I realized that something changed fundamentally with that experience of being shamed in front of my entire class for asking a question. Because I came to realize, and I quickly caught on to the fact, that being in school was not really about learning. It was about how much you can absorb and then repeat during an exam. And so that's what I did, with quite a bit of success. Unfortunately, a part of me died, that part that was curious and wanted to know things and wanted to know why things were being done the way they were done, simply because a teacher didn't find it necessary to tell me why I needed to study agriculture. But as I grew older, I realized that not anyone could answer that question, not my teacher, not my parents, not even my government, as to why I really need to study agriculture. So what's wrong with that? I think the problem with a lot of the ways in which we're educated, whether it's at home or at school, is that we're taught what to think and not how to think. And the problem with that is the world we live in is vastly different from what it was a few years ago. It's not so much about producing things, it's about creating things. We're not in an assembly line in a factory anymore. We're living in a world where you need to innovate and create and find solutions to problems and create things that are new. And if all you know how to do is produce and regurgitate things that were taught to you, then it's a very difficult world to live in. And I did a Google search the other day for African inventions, like amazing African inventions, and it was really sad to see that the only amazing African invention I could find on Google was from like 1500 BC, from the Egyptian civilization. And I thought that was just devastating. Why is it that we do not seem to create, to innovate, to solve our own problems, and we have to sort of import solutions that people create for us? That for me is a very big question. And I think it comes down to how we're taught to think. Not what we're taught to think, but how we're taught to think. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. There was this study that was done, and they found that the average human being has between 12 to 60,000 thoughts a day. Now that's a whole lot of thoughts. But here's the more scary statistic. Apparently, 98% of those thoughts are the same day to day. Well, maybe not exactly, but fundamentally. So you'll think about, well, which route should I use as I go to work? Or you'll think about, what should I have for lunch today? Or you'll think about, how do I get this report done? So fundamentally, 98% of our thoughts are the same every single day. And when you think about the fact that, I don't know, maybe you've heard this saying that watch your thoughts, they become your words, and your words become your actions. If you think about that, then anything that can happen in your life or in your community can only begin as a thought. Without that thought, there's no action. And if you're having the same thoughts every day, then it's very unlikely that you are going to cause the kind of change that you want in your life or in your environment or in your community or whatever it is. So these are some of the things that got me thinking there must be a better way to think. And I just want to talk about, very quickly, just 3 ways that I've been learning to think that have dramatically improved the way I live. The first one is what people would call critical thinking. Now, if you've done a dissertation or an essay, this is probably something you came across. But I want to talk about it in less academic and more practical, everyday terms. For me, critical thinking can be narrowed down to one question or one word, and that word is why. I remember hearing a story once that I found really interesting. So it was about this man, and I'll say he brought a leg of goat home every, once in a while. And so the way his wife would make it is she would trim certain parts of the goat, which were edible, and throw them away, and then cook the rest of it. And so this man asked his wife, well, how come you do that? Why do you throw away the rest of the goat? And she said, well, that's just how we do things in our family. This is the tradition. We've always done this. This is how we make goat meat. And he was a bit perplexed, but he let it go. So when he got a chance, he asked his wife's mother and said, why do you do this? And his wife's mother said, well, that's just how we've done it. That's how my mother taught me to do it, and that's how I taught my daughter to do it, and that's how we make goat meat. Finally, he got the opportunity to ask his wife's mother's mother. So her great-grandmother? Grandmother? Something. And when he asked her this question, she said, well, the reason we used to do that was because we didn't have refrigerators. So anything we kept would go bad. And yet, fast forward a few decades, and you do have refrigerators, but you're still doing the same things that you used to when you didn't, without really asking why. And I think a lot of the time we can get stuck in that rut. Is our education system relevant? Should we be churning out graduates every single year who are cut out for office jobs, yet what we need are entrepreneurs and innovators? I think it's very easy to get stuck in the same way of doing things. I mean, even the way we do TV, for instance, and that's my line of work. Why do we wait for 9 o'clock to have a news bulletin when everybody's read the papers, they've seen everything on Twitter, they already know what's happened? Why do we continue to have the news at 9 p.m.? Those are the kind of questions that we need to ask. And those are the kind of questions we can ask when we start to think critically. So another example I'll give is the difference between how and why. Because when you think critically, you're asking the question why, and I think that's a better question than how. A small example is, in my business, we do have quite a problem in the sense that people like to poach our staff. So we spend years and years training them, and then someone comes along and offers them better money, and we can't compete with that because we're a small company, and so we lose this person that we've spent so long training. So we did ask the question, obviously, the natural question to ask is, well, how do we retain our staff? But I realized the better question was why. Why would our staff stay with us and not go somewhere else? Because if you ask, how do we retain our staff, then you're going to look at how it's been done before. You're going to say, well, you can give them better pay, you can, and all those other things. But if you ask, why would staff stay with me, then you're starting a different journey. Instead of dealing with the symptom, you're going to deal with the cause. So we've had some pretty unconventional ways of dealing with that because we ask those kind of questions. And sometimes it's little things, like you will not believe how much of a difference giving your staff lunch makes when you're a small company. Things like that. Things that matter to the people that you're employing. And also, people are different, so one person's need will be different from another person's. So if you're asking why and not how, you stand a chance to get better answers. And this can work on a small scale and a big scale as well. If we talk about things like poverty, yeah? The world is asking, how do we solve the problem of poverty? And they say, well, let's provide aid and give funding and start up projects. But if we asked why does poverty exist, we'd find that we're approaching this in a very different way, because poverty cannot be solved by throwing money at it. It's not about money. It's about an attitude, it's about a culture, it's about a system that systemically provides an environment where poverty can exist. And when you start asking why, you address the root of that problem instead of asking how and just addressing the symptom of that problem. So the first thing is critical thinking. It's really important to ask why. Whenever you receive some information, don't just take it for granted. It's a really good thing to ask why. So that's the first one. The second thing is thinking selectively. You can think critically, and then you can think selectively. Now, some people like to call this thinking positively, which is good, but I like to think about it as thinking selectively, because thinking positively implies that you'll think only positive thoughts, and I think that's literally impossible. That same study I mentioned found that 80% of our thoughts tend to actually be negative. You know, it will be things like, I'm not going to make it to work in time, or my boss hates me, or I'm never going to get this report done. Our thoughts tend to be negative. So thinking positively can be hard, and sometimes it can also result in some kind of denial. But thinking selectively is, I'll equate it to this. You know, they say you can't stop a bird from flying over your head, yeah? But you can stop it from landing on your head and laying a nest, you know, and making a nest. It's the same thing with your thoughts. You might not be able to stop yourself from having negative thoughts, but you can definitely choose which thoughts to keep and which to discard. Because the other question I think is important for us to ask ourselves is who is renting space in our minds? Sometimes we think all the thoughts that we have are ours, and yet many times they're actually not. They came from somewhere, and they're ingrained in us because of something. And it's good to investigate and examine where exactly they came from. I think it was Tessa who mentioned failure and the way we look at failure. And that was really interesting for me, because I think one of the biggest and hardest decisions I ever had to make was whether to give up on the first business that I started with my business partner, my sister. And this was bad. This was really bad. We had to pay rent of like $2,500 a month, and yet we weren't making that much. And then everything we got from, because we both had jobs, but everything we got from our jobs was going into the business, and it wasn't working out. But we had faith, and we hoped, and we believed. We even changed venues and moved to another one, hoping that this one would work out, and it wasn't any better. Our staff was stealing from us. At that time, my mom had cancer, so I was in the hospital literally the whole time. And it was just so difficult. But for some reason, we held on. I think it was 2 years that we held on like this. And the mantra that we had was, you know, you can't give up, you mustn't give up, you're not supposed to give up. And I remember one day going to the business premises, and I was really hoping that we'd made, you know, a good bit of money that day, because rent was due the next day, and if we hadn't, you know, made the cut, it was just disaster. And I remember looking to the book, and all there was for that day was tweezing, 3,000 shillings. And I sat there and laughed, because it was absolutely ridiculous and just really discouraging and disheartening. And at that point I felt like an absolute failure, and I could never be any good at business, and what was I doing anyway? I should just find a rich Arab sheikh to get married to. So that didn't pan out, by the way. But at that point I realized, wait, why am I looking at it this way? I think our society has so stigmatized this issue of failure, yet if you look at the facts and the statistics, even an inventor, anyone who created anything will tell you, you have to fail several times before you succeed. And yet our entire world, our entire society will tell you that failure is a thing to be ashamed of and a thing to run away from. And I think it's why so many of us are so afraid to even try. Yet if we even once just try to turn away from the way we think about failure, and instead of thinking about it as something that is shameful, think about it as actually a good thing, because it means that you tried something, it didn't work, but guess what? Now you know that this is a way that doesn't work. Thank you. And so I told myself that, okay, Winston Churchill, get out of my mind. You're renting space in my mind because you're the guy who said, never give up, never give up, never give up. Sometimes you have to give up. Sometimes it's not working. Know when to quit. And so, you know, aside from being worried about seeming like we didn't make it work and what that would do to your reputation, we just decided, yeah, we sold the business and moved on to something else. And the second business worked out a lot better. We learned so many lessons that have made life so much easier. And when I look back on it now, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, failing at that business, because sometimes it's the best way to learn. But if you don't transform your mind, this is something that can cripple you, and you'll feel like you can never do anything else just because you've failed one time. So again, it's choosing your thoughts. It's choosing what you want to believe. Because at the end of the day, you're the one who decides. You're the one who decides what's true for you. Just because someone else says they can't do it doesn't mean that you can't. So thinking selectively. Not so much positively, but selectively. Positively is good too. But also you have to choose your thoughts and know where you're coming from. So the last thing I'll talk about is thinking big. And we talk about this a lot. But when I say thinking big, I'm not talking about scale, I'm talking about scope. What I mean by this is, I'm not saying if you're thinking about a $20 million business, think about a $200 million business. No, I'm saying if you're thinking about this, something, think about more than just you. Think about how you can impact your community, your society, the people around you, how you can do something that is bigger than just your own personal needs. Because this life is too short, and this world is so fleeting, it makes no sense to do something that will only benefit you. So if you have learned to think and to create and to innovate, think of something that will go beyond you. Let me use this example. What's the best football team in the world besides Liverpool? Chelsea? Okay, a few men just woke up. They just heard Arsenal. All right, well, okay, that's going to be contentious. So let's talk about, okay, in the World Cup, what's the best team? Oh, Bunamwaya FC. Okay, so let's go with Uganda Cranes. Let's think positively and say that Uganda Cranes is at the World Cup finals, yeah? And who's the best striker? From Uganda Cranes? Okay. So let's say Massa has a penalty, right? And this is the decider for the game. Like if he scores this one, then that's it. The game is done and we win. We win the World Cup. Now let's say that Massa is an amazing critical thinker and he has a lot of information and data at his disposal. And this is what he knows, yeah? So statistics have shown that if you're trying to kick a penalty, you can actually tell percentages what the goalkeeper is going to do. So if you're a right-footed player and this is your good leg, the keeper 51% of the time, is it 51 or 57? Let me just check. I don't want to tell you lies. So the keeper apparently 57% of the time is going to dive to his right because that's your left corner and that's where your good leg kicks if you're a right-footed player. And then 47% of the time, he's going to dive to the left because he assumes that you might want to confuse him and so you'll kick in that direction because there's a chance that you might do that. So those are the odds, 57, 41. However, only 2% of the time will the keeper stay in the center. Only 2% of the time. So statistically, your best chance at getting that penalty is to kick the ball straight to the keeper. How many of us would do that? Exactly. Yeah, my thoughts exactly. So this is where this interesting conundrum comes in, because much as we know that the best thing to do statistically is kick the ball straight to the keeper, there's another dynamic that comes in here, and that's a very human dynamic. It's the fear of shame. Because, and where that comes from is actually motivation. What is your motivation for thinking the way you do? Because if, for sure, this keeper's best interest was to win glory for his nation and make, his nation proud and have his nation win the World Cup, he'd probably say, whatever the odds are, I'm going to kick straight down the middle because that is my best bet. However, this guy, honestly, is probably thinking about himself. He's thinking, if I kick the ball down the middle and the keeper gets it, even though there's only a 2% chance that he will, I'm going to look really, really stupid, I'm just going to look daft, like who does that? Because that's not the natural thing to do. If I kick to the right or the left, yeah, there's a bigger chance that I might not score, but hey, at least guys will say, yeah, good on him, he tried, gave it his best shot, well done, old boy, and and that's it. And the problem is that a lot of the time, the fear is what wins. The fear of shame, the fear of failure is what wins, which is why motivation is really important. When you're thinking big, think outside of yourself. Because if you only think about yourself, you will never be able to achieve anything huge, anything large. If you think only about yourself, you will always be limited by the fear of ridicule, the fear of criticism, the fear of failure. But if you've got a goal that's bigger than just yourself, and if you're willing to put your ego and your pride aside for that, then you can achieve something that is truly remarkable. So that's what I'm talking about when I say think big. It's not about scale, it's about scope. So just to wrap up, all I'm saying is I think we need to learn how to think, not just what to think. And the 3 ways that I've been doing that are really working for me. And that's thinking critically, also thinking selectively, choosing which thoughts to have and which thoughts to discard, and knowing which ones are yours and which ones are not. And also just thinking bigger, thinking outside of yourself. If you want to see a place that's full of potential, go to a graveyard. It's full of books that were never written, songs that were never sung, things that were never done. But the truth about life is that you can only have a great reward if you take a great risk. And it starts essentially with your thoughts. So last weekend, this is just my final thought, I went bungee jumping. How many have been bungee jumping? Yeah? What was it like? You're fearless. You watch from a distance. Close enough. Yeah, so it was absolutely paralyzing. Like you're standing on this platform and there's nothing in front of you but water. And you're supposed to just let go and make this plunge. And I stood on that platform and thought to myself, well, clearly I don't have enough problems. Like, why am I here? Thank you. Yes, but the one thought that came to me was that, literally I'm capable of jumping. Like physically, I'm able to jump. There's nothing restraining me. There is nothing around me stopping me from jumping, except for one thing, and that's my mind. And so this dude behind me says, I've done this 37 times. The more you think about it, the harder it becomes. And that's the truth about life. Your thoughts determine where you're going to go. My physical ability did not stop me from making that jump. It was this thought and this fear that I had in my mind that paralyzed me. And until I turned that around and said, I'm going to do this, nothing was able to move. And it's the same thing with a lot of us. You may think that your limitation is your circumstance, where you were born, where you went to school, or whatever else it is that's in your way. But really, a lot of it is in our minds. A lot of our limitations are in our minds, in the way we think, and changing our thoughts is the first step to seeing a change in our lives, in our communities, in our society, in our continent, which is something I really hope for. And I hope that this is something that we can all do, is just learn how to create positive thoughts. Because the future is not something you will go into, it's something you will create with your thoughts. Thank you very much for listening.